The woman sat alone at the corner table of the dusty saloon in Wickenburg, Arizona Territory, hunched over a piece of paper with ink-stained fingers, her lips moving silently as she wrote words that would never be read by their intended recipient. It was late summer in 1878, and the heat made everything shimmer like a mirage outside the wooden building. Inside, the air hung thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of whiskey, but Caroline Vaughn seemed oblivious to her surroundings, completely absorbed in her letter writing. She had been doing this every evening for the past 3 weeks, always ordering a single glass of water, always sitting in the same spot, always writing with an intensity that suggested her very life depended on it. Harrison Blake watched her from the bar, his dusty boots resting on the brass rail, his weathered hands wrapped around a glass of whiskey he had barely touched. He had ridden into town 2 days ago, planning to stay just long enough to resupply before heading north to Montana, where he had heard there was work for experienced ranch hands. But something about the woman in the corner kept him rooted to this spot, kept him coming back to this particular saloon when there were 3 others in town that offered better liquor and prettier entertainment. She was beautiful in a way that seemed out of place in Wickenburg, with dark hair that she kept pinned up in a practical bun and eyes so green. They reminded him of the forests back east that he had not seen since childhood. But it was not her beauty that caught his attention. It was the sadness that seemed to emanate from her like heat from a stove, the way her shoulders curved inward as if she were trying to protect something precious and already broken. "She does that every night," the bartender said, following Harrison's gaze. "Been doing it for weeks now. Writes those letters, folds them up real careful, and then burns them in the fireplace before she leaves." Harrison frowned, his fingers tightening around his glass. "Burns them. Every single one. Won't mail them, won't keep them. Just writes them and burns them like some kind of ritual." The bartender, a portly man named George with a salt and pepper beard, leaned closer. "Folks say she lost someone. Brother maybe, or a sweetheart, someone who ain't coming back." Harrison said nothing, but his eyes remained fixed on Caroline as she dipped her pen in the inkwell and continued writing. Her hand moved with practiced grace across the paper, forming words that he could not see from this distance, but could imagine were filled with the kind of longing that made a person's chest ache. He had known that kind of longing himself once, though it had been years ago now. He had learned to live with the emptiness, to fill his days with hard work, and his nights with the kind of dreamless sleep that came from physical exhaustion. But watching this woman pour her heart onto paper that would only turn to ash stirred something in him, that he thought had died somewhere between the battlefields of the war and the endless stretch of years that followed. The saloon door swung open, letting in a blast of hot evening air and 3 men who were clearly already drunk from somewhere else. They were ranch hands from the look of them, dusty and loud, the kind of men who thought their voices needed to fill every available space. Harrison felt his jaw tighten as one of them noticed Caroline and elbowed his companion. "Well, well," the man said, his voice carrying across the room. "Look at the little schoolmarm over there. What are you writing, sweetheart? Love letters?" Caroline's hand stilled for just a moment, but she did not look up. Harrison saw the way her fingers whitened around the pen, the only sign that she had heard the comment at all. The man took her silence as an invitation and swaggered toward her table, his companions following with the kind of grinning anticipation that made Harrison's blood run cold. He set his glass down carefully on the bar and straightened, his hand moving instinctively to check that his revolver was still in its place on his hip. "I am talking to you," the man said, reaching Caroline's table and leaning over it with both hands planted on the scarred wood. It is rude to ignore someone who is being friendly. Please leave me alone, Caroline said quietly, her voice barely audible over the general noise of the saloon. Leave you alone? Now why would I do that when you are sitting here all by yourself, looking so lonely? The man reached out to grab the paper she was writing on, and that was when Harrison moved. He crossed the distance between the bar and the table in 4 long strides, his hand clamping down on the drunk's wrist before his fingers could touch the letter. The man jerked back, startled, his eyes focusing with difficulty on Harrison's face. "The lady asked you to leave her alone," Harrison said, his voice quiet but carrying a note of steel that made the other 2 men take a step back. "This ain't your business, stranger," the drunk said, trying to pull his wrist free and finding that he could not. "We are just being friendly." "No, you are being disrespectful. Now you and your friends can go find somewhere else to drink, or we can take this outside and settle it a different way." "Your choice." For a moment the drunk seemed to consider arguing, but something in Harrison's eyes made him reconsider. He yanked his hand free and backed away, spitting on the floor. "She ain't worth the trouble anyway," he muttered, jerking his head at his companions. The 3 of them stumbled out of the saloon, leaving behind a silence that gradually filled back up with normal conversation as the other patrons returned to their own business. Harrison looked down at Caroline, who was staring at him with those impossibly green eyes, her expression unreadable. Up close, he could see the fine lines of stress around her mouth, the shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Thank you," she said after a moment, her voice still quiet but steadier now, "though I have dealt with worse." "I am sure you have," Harrison said, and meant it. A woman alone in a frontier town would have faced all manner of unwanted attention, but you should not have to. He started to turn away, to give her back the privacy she clearly valued, but her voice stopped him. "You have been watching me." It was not a question. Harrison felt heat rise to his face, embarrassed to be caught. "I apologize, madam. I did not mean to make you uncomfortable." "You did not. I just wondered why." She tilted her head slightly, studying him with an intensity that made him feel exposed. "Most people either ignore me completely or bother me like those men did. You are the first person in weeks to just watch." Harrison did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing. After a moment, Caroline gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Would you like to sit down?" "I find I am tired of my own company." He should have said no. He should have tipped his hat politely and walked away, continued with his plan to leave Wickenburg and head north. Getting involved with a sad woman who wrote letters to no one was the last thing he needed. But he found himself pulling out the chair and sitting down anyway, his long legs folding awkwardly under the small table. "Harrison Blake," he said, offering his hand across the table. "Caroline Vaughn." Her hand was small in his, but her grip was firm. "You are not from around here?" "No, madam." "Just passing through, or I was planning to. And now I am not so sure." A ghost of a smile touched her lips, there and gone so quickly he almost missed it. She looked down at the letter in front of her, the ink already drying on the page. From this angle he could see the neat, flowing script, but he deliberately did not try to read the words. Whatever she was writing was not meant for him. "The bartender says you burn your letters," Harrison said, then immediately regretted it when he saw her stiffen. "I am sorry. That was rude." "Your business is your own." "No, it is all right. I suppose it must seem strange." Caroline touched the edge of the paper with one finger, a gesture so gentle it was like she was afraid the words might evaporate. "I write to my brother. He died 2 years ago in a mining accident in Colorado. I know he will never read them, but sometimes I have things I need to say to him, and writing them down helps." Harrison felt his chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. He knew about loss, about the need to speak to people who could no longer answer. I am sorry for your loss. Thank you. She looked up at him again, and this time there was something different in her eyes, a kind of cautious curiosity. What brings you to Wickenburg, Mr. Blake? Harrison, please. And I am just looking for work. Heard there might be opportunities up north, thought I would try my luck. You are a ranch hand, among other things. I have worked cattle, broken horses, done some farming, whatever pays. That sounds like a hard life. It is the only one I know. They sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the saloon washing over them like waves. Harrison found himself noticing small details about her. The way she absently twisted a loose thread on her sleeve, the slight callus on her middle finger from holding a pen, the way her eyes seemed to hold a depth of sadness that he recognized, because he saw it in his own reflection every morning when he shaved. I should finish this, Caroline said finally, gesturing to the letter. I am sorry I am keeping you from your evening. You are not keeping me from anything important, Harrison said truthfully. He stood up anyway, sensing that she needed her space. But as he was about to walk away, words came out of his mouth before he could stop them. Write to me. Caroline looked up, startled. What? Instead of writing to someone who cannot answer, write to me. I promise I will always answer. The words hung in the air between them, and Harrison felt his face heat up again. It was a foolish thing to say, the kind of romantic nonsense that had no place in the practical realities of frontier life. He was about to take it back, to make some excuse and leave before he embarrassed himself further, when Caroline's expression softened. You do not even know me, she said quietly. No, but I would like to. And you look like someone who could use a friend who writes back. For a long moment, she just looked at him, and he could see the war happening behind her eyes, the part of her that wanted to say yes battling with the part that was afraid. Finally, she nodded just once, a small movement that sent a rush of warmth through his chest. All right, she said. I will write to you, Harrison Blake, but I warn you, I have a lot to say. Good, he said, and he found himself smiling for the first time in what felt like months. I look forward to reading every word. He left the saloon that night feeling lighter than he had in years, the Arizona heat feeling less oppressive somehow. He had no idea where this would lead, or if it would lead anywhere at all. But for the first time since he could remember, he was looking forward to tomorrow. Caroline watched him go, her heart beating faster than it should. She looked down at the half-finished letter to her brother and then, on impulse, pushed it aside and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. She dipped her pen in the inkwell and began to write. Dear Harrison, she began, and the words came easier than she expected. You probably think I am strange, a woman who writes letters to the dead. You would be right. But there is something about you that makes me want to try again, to reach out to someone who might actually reach back. I do not know what I am doing or why I agreed to this, but I suppose that is part of the adventure, is it not? Not knowing where we are going but trusting that it might be somewhere good. She wrote for another hour, filling 3 pages with her small, neat handwriting. She wrote about her brother Thomas, about how he had always been the brave one, the one who chased adventure while she stayed home and played it safe. She wrote about how guilty she felt for being alive when he was not, about how she had come to Wickenburg trying to outrun her grief and found that it had followed her like a shadow. She wrote about the loneliness that had become so familiar it was almost comfortable, and about how terrifying it was to think about letting someone in again. When she finally finished, she folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her reticule instead of throwing it in the fire. Tomorrow, she would find out where Harrison was staying and deliver it. The thought made her nervous and excited in equal measure. The next morning dawned clear and hot, the sun already fierce by the time Caroline walked to the boarding house where she had learned Harrison was staying. She had asked George the bartender, trying to sound casual about it, and he had given her a knowing look that made her blush but had answered readily enough. The boarding house was a two-story structure at the edge of town, run by a widow named Martha Chen who had married a Chinese prospector and stayed in Wickenburg after his death. Caroline knocked on the door and waited, her letter feeling like it weighed 100 pounds in her hand. Martha answered, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner that Caroline had always appreciated. "Miss Vaughn," she said, surprised. "What brings you here?" "I am looking for one of your guests, Harrison Blake. Is he in?" Martha's expression shifted to one of interest, but she did not comment. "He went out about an hour ago, said something about checking on his horse at the livery. You can wait for him if you like, or I can give him a message." Caroline hesitated, then held out the letter. "Could you give him this, please?" "Of course." Martha took the letter, glancing down at it with obvious curiosity. "Should I expect him to be staying longer then? He paid for a week but seemed like he might be moving on." "I do not know," Caroline said honestly. "I hope so." Martha smiled, the expression transforming her severe face into something warm and almost motherly. "He seems like a good man. Quiet, polite. We could use more like him around here." Caroline nodded and left, her heart racing. She spent the rest of the morning trying to focus on her work at the general store where she had found employment as a bookkeeper. But her mind kept wandering to Harrison, wondering what he would think of her letter, if he would write back like he promised. She did not have to wait long. When she returned to her small rented room above the seamstress shop that afternoon, she found a letter slipped under her door. Her name was written on the outside in strong, angular handwriting that was surprisingly neat for a man who worked with his hands. Caroline sat on her narrow bed and opened the envelope with shaking fingers. "Dear Caroline," the letter began. "Thank you for trusting me with your words. I read your letter 3 times, not because I did not understand it the first time, but because I wanted to make sure I did not miss anything important. You are not strange for writing to your brother. We all have people we wish we could talk to one more time. For me, it is my mother. She died when I was 12, and there are still days when I want to tell her about something I saw or ask her advice about something I cannot figure out on my own. I understand about guilt too. I fought in the war on the Union side, and I did things I am not proud of because I was told they were necessary. I have carried that weight for 13 years now, and I do not think it will ever get lighter. But I have learned that guilt is just love with nowhere to go. You loved your brother, and now that he is gone, all that love has turned inward and become something that hurts. Maybe writing to someone who can write back will help you find a place to put some of that love where it can do some good. I am not good with words like you are. I never went past basic schooling, and most of what I learned came from doing rather than reading. But I want you to know that I meant what I said last night. Write to me about anything you want, and I will always answer. You do not have to be alone with your thoughts anymore, not if you do not want to be. Yours truly, Harrison. Caroline read the letter 4 times, then pressed it against her chest and closed her eyes. She could feel tears on her cheeks, but they were not the bitter tears of grief that she had cried so many times before. These were different, softer somehow, like rain after a long drought. She got up and went to her small desk, pulling out paper and ink. She wrote back immediately, and this time the words came even easier. Thus began a correspondence that consumed them both over the following weeks. They wrote to each other daily, sometimes twice a day, the letters growing longer and more intimate as they revealed themselves to each other in ways that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. Caroline wrote about her childhood in Ohio, about her parents who had died of fever when she was 19, leaving her and Thomas to fend for themselves. She wrote about how Thomas had convinced her to move west, chasing the promise of gold and adventure, and how she had followed because she could not imagine being left alone. She wrote about the mining camp where Thomas had died, about how she had held his hand as he passed and promised him she would keep living, even though she had not been sure she wanted to. Harrison wrote about growing up in Pennsylvania, about how his father had been a drunk who disappeared when Harrison was 10, leaving him and his mother to survive on their own. He wrote about joining the army at 15, lying about his age because he was big for it and they did not ask too many questions. He wrote about the war, not in great detail but enough for her to understand the weight he carried. He wrote about the years after, drifting from job to job, town to town, never quite finding a place that felt like home, but they did not just write about the past. They wrote about the present too, about the small details of their days that felt important because they were sharing them with each other. Caroline wrote about the customers at the general store, about the woman who came in every Tuesday to buy the same items in the same order, about the child who had tried to steal candy and burst into tears when caught. Harrison wrote about helping repair a barn for a farmer outside town, about a horse he was training that had a stubborn streak a mile wide, about the sunset he saw that reminded him of a painting his mother used to have. They also began spending time together outside of their letters. Harrison found reasons to visit the general store, always needing some small item that Caroline suspected he did not actually need. She started taking her evening meals at the boarding house instead of eating alone in her room, sitting at the communal table where Harrison also ate. They went for walks in the cooler hours of early morning or late evening, talking as they strolled along the dusty streets or out into the scrubland beyond town. One evening, about 6 weeks after their first meeting, they walked out to a spot Harrison had discovered, a small outcropping of rocks that overlooked the valley. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple that seemed too beautiful to be real. "I should have left weeks ago," Harrison said, his eyes on the horizon. "I have stayed far longer than I planned." Caroline felt her stomach drop. She had known this was coming, had told herself not to get attached, but it had happened anyway. "Are you leaving then?" "I do not want to," he said, turning to look at her. "But I need work. My savings are almost gone and I cannot live off charity." "What if there was work here?" Caroline asked, the words tumbling out before she could think them through. "Old Mr. Davis, who owns the big ranch south of town, he has been looking for a foreman. He mentioned it at the store last week. I could introduce you." Harrison's expression was unreadable in the fading light. "You want me to stay?" "Yes," Caroline said, her heart pounding. "I want you to stay. These past weeks have been the happiest I have been since Thomas died, maybe even before that. I know we have only known each other a short time, but I feel like I can breathe again when I am with you. Please do not go." For a moment, Harrison said nothing, and Caroline felt a spike of fear that she had said too much, revealed too much. Then he reached out and took her hand, his palm warm and calloused against hers. "I feel the same way," he said quietly. "I have been running for so long, Caroline. Running from the war, from my past, from myself. But when I am with you, I do not feel like running anymore. I feel like I finally found something worth staying for." "Then stay," Caroline whispered. Harrison lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, a gesture so tender it made her eyes sting with tears. "I will talk to Mr. Davis tomorrow." That night, Caroline did not write a letter to her brother. Instead, she wrote in the journal she had started keeping, recording her own thoughts and feelings. She wrote about Harrison, about how he made her laugh with his dry observations about the world, about how safe she felt when he was near, about how, for the first time since Thomas died, She could imagine a future that held something other than endless grief. Harrison got the job with Mr. Davis, a gruff but fair man who owned several thousand acres and more cattle than Caroline could count. The work was hard, starting before dawn and often not finishing until after dark, but Harrison thrived on it. He moved out of the boarding house and into the foreman's cabin on the ranch, a small but sturdy structure that had been empty for months. Their courtship continued, though now they saw each other less frequently due to Harrison's work schedule. But they still wrote letters every day, and Harrison came into town every Sunday, the one day Mr. Davis gave his workers off. They would attend church together in the morning, then spend the afternoon however they chose, walking, talking, sometimes just sitting in companionable silence while Caroline read aloud from a book, and Harrison whittled small figures from pieces of wood. It was on one of these Sundays, 3 months after they first met, that Harrison asked the question that Caroline had been simultaneously hoping for and dreading. They were sitting under a cottonwood tree by the dry creek bed, enjoying the relative coolness of the shade. Caroline had been reading from a collection of poems, but she had stopped, distracted by the way Harrison was looking at her. "What is it?" she asked, smiling. Harrison set down the piece of wood he had been working on and turned to face her fully. "Caroline, I need to ask you something important." Her heart began to race. "All right. I know we have not known each other long, and I know I do not have much to offer. I am just a ranch foreman with a hard past and an uncertain future, but I love you. I think I have loved you since that first night I saw you writing your letters, looking so sad and so beautiful it made my chest hurt. I want to spend the rest of my life making you smile, making you happy. Will you marry me?" Caroline felt tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling so wide her cheeks hurt. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, Harrison, I will marry you." He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and she did not care. She wrapped her arms around his neck and held on just as tightly, feeling like she had finally come home after a long and difficult journey. They were married 6 weeks later in the small church in Wickenburg, with Martha Chen and George the bartender standing as witnesses. Caroline wore a simple dress of pale blue that Martha had helped her sew, and Harrison wore a new suit that he had bought specially for the occasion, looking uncomfortable but handsome in the formal clothes. The ceremony was brief, the preacher speaking about love and commitment while Caroline and Harrison stood hand in hand, unable to stop looking at each other. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and told Harrison he could kiss his bride, Harrison cupped Caroline's face in his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that made several of the women in attendance dab at their eyes. Mr. Davis gave them 3 days off for a honeymoon and the use of a small cabin he owned up in the hills, a place he used when he went hunting. It was rustic but clean, and it felt like paradise to Caroline and Harrison. They spent those 3 days learning each other in new ways, talking and laughing and making love with the kind of passion that came from months of restraint finally being released. On the second night, as they lay tangled together under a worn quilt, Harrison tracing lazy patterns on Caroline's bare shoulder, she said, "I never thought I would be this happy again. After Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over." Harrison kissed the top of her head. "I know what you mean. I had given up on the idea of having a real home, a real family. I thought I was meant to just drift forever. And now I know exactly where I belong, right here with you." Caroline turned in his arms so she could see his face, illuminated by the moonlight coming through the cabin window. "I wrote Thomas a letter yesterday," she said softly. "A real one this time, not one I planned to burn. I told him about you, about us. I told him I was happy and that I hoped he would approve. Then I put it in the box with all your letters to me. You kept all my letters. Every single one. I have them tied with a ribbon in my trunk. Sometimes when you are working late and I miss you, I read them again." Harrison's eyes were suspiciously bright. "I kept yours too. All of them." They held each other in the darkness, and Caroline felt something shift inside her, a weight she had been carrying for 2 years finally beginning to lift. She would always miss Thomas, would always carry the grief of his loss, but she was learning that she could hold both the sadness and the joy, that one did not negate the other. When they returned to the ranch after their honeymoon, Caroline moved into the foreman's cabin with Harrison. It was small, just 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, but Caroline set about making it a home. She sewed curtains for the windows and braided a rug for the floor. She planted a vegetable garden out back and filled the windowsills with pots of herbs. Harrison built her a desk where she could write her letters and keep her books, placing it near the window where the light was best. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Harrison worked long hours on the ranch, but he always came home to Caroline, and that made even the hardest days bearable. Caroline continued working at the general store part-time, saving her wages carefully. They talked about the future, about maybe saving enough to buy their own small piece of land someday, to build something that was entirely theirs. 6 months after their wedding, Caroline realized she had not had her monthly courses in some time. She waited another few weeks to be sure, then told Harrison one evening over dinner. His face went through a series of expressions so quickly she almost laughed. Shock, then joy, then fear, then settling finally on a kind of wonder. "A baby," he said, his voice rough. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes," Caroline said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "Are you happy?" "Happy?" Harrison stood up so quickly his chair nearly tipped over, then rounded the table to pull her into his arms. "Caroline, I am terrified and thrilled and more grateful than I have words for. A baby, our baby." That night, they lay in bed with Harrison's hand spread across Caroline's still flat stomach, talking about names and making plans. Harrison admitted he was scared he would not know how to be a good father, having not had one himself. Caroline confessed she was worried about childbirth, having heard too many stories of women who did not survive it. But they comforted each other, promising to face whatever came together. The pregnancy was difficult. Caroline suffered from terrible sickness in the first months, unable to keep much food down. Harrison worried constantly, bringing her ginger tea and dry crackers, rubbing her back when she was ill. But by the 4th month, the sickness passed, and Caroline began to bloom. Her skin glowed, her eyes sparkled, and Harrison told her at least once a day that she had never been more beautiful. As her belly grew, so did their excitement. Harrison spent his evenings building a cradle, sanding the wood until it was smooth as silk. Caroline sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her heart swelling each time she imagined holding her baby wrapped in them. They argued good-naturedly about names, each having their favorites, finally agreeing that they would wait until they saw the baby to decide what fit. Caroline went into labor on a cold January morning in 1880, nearly 18 months after she and Harrison had first met. The birth was long and difficult, lasting almost 20 hours. Harrison paced outside the cabin while Martha Chen and the midwife attended to Caroline, his face gray with worry every time he heard her cry out. Finally, as the sun was setting, he heard a different sound, the wail of a newborn baby. He burst into the cabin to find Martha holding a squirming bundle wrapped in one of the blankets Caroline had made. "You have a son," Martha said, beaming. "A big, healthy boy." Harrison barely heard her. His eyes had gone to Caroline, who lay pale and exhausted in their bed. The midwife, a capable woman named Ruth, was cleaning up and she looked up when he entered. "She did wonderfully," Ruth said. "It was a hard birth, but she is strong. She will be fine." Harrison moved to Caroline's side, kneeling beside the bed. She turned her head to look at him, and despite her exhaustion, she was smiling. "We have a son," she whispered. "I heard. Are you all right? I am tired, but I am fine. Do you want to hold him?" Martha brought the baby over, placing him carefully in Harrison's arms. He looked down at the tiny face, the little nose and mouth, the eyes that were trying to focus on this new world, and felt something break open in his chest. This was his son, his and Caroline's, a new life that they had created together. "Hello," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Hello, little one. I am your father, and I promise I will do everything I can to be a good one." The baby made a small sound, and Harrison laughed, the sound half sob. Caroline reached out and he took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "What should we name him?" she asked. Harrison looked at her, then back down at their son. "Thomas," he said. "If you would like, after your brother." Caroline's eyes filled with tears. "Are you sure?" "I am sure. Your brother should be here to see this, to meet his nephew. Since he cannot be, we can honor him this way." Caroline nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. Harrison carefully placed their son in her arms, and she looked down at the baby, at Thomas, and felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. "Hello, Thomas," she whispered. "You are so loved already, so very loved." The first months of Thomas's life were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. He was a fussy baby, prone to colic and crying at odd hours, but neither Caroline nor Harrison minded. They took turns walking him when he would not sleep, singing to him and telling him stories. Harrison proved to be a natural father despite his fears, patient and gentle with the baby, always ready to help with whatever was needed. Mr. Davis was understanding about Harrison needing more time at home in those early weeks, cutting his hours and giving him tasks closer to the cabin when possible. The old rancher had taken a liking to both Harrison and Caroline, often stopping by to check on them and the baby, bringing supplies and advice that was usually welcome. As Thomas grew, so did their family's happiness. He was a bright, active child, quick to smile and laugh, curious about everything. By the time he was 6 months old, he was already trying to crawl, much to his parents' delight and concern. Caroline had to rearrange the cabin to make it safer, moving anything breakable or dangerous out of reach. Harrison was promoted again, this time to general manager of the entire ranch operation. The pay increase was substantial, and it meant they could finally start seriously saving for their own land. Mr. Davis, whose health was beginning to fail, relied heavily on Harrison's judgment and work ethic, often saying that he did not know what he would do without him. When Thomas was a year old, Caroline discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and in the spring of 1881, she gave birth to a daughter they named Helen, after Harrison's mother. Helen was a quieter baby than Thomas had been, with Caroline's green eyes and Harrison's dark hair. Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister, always wanting to help take care of her, to hold her and show her his toys. Life was full and busy and sometimes chaotic, but Caroline had never been happier. Every night, after the children were asleep, she and Harrison would sit together on the porch of their cabin, holding hands and talking about their day. Sometimes they would remember those early letters they had written to each other, marveling at how far they had come from that first night in the saloon when she had been writing to no one, and he had promised to always answer. When Thomas was 3 and Helen was nearly 2, Mr. Davis called Harrison into his office for a serious conversation. The old man was failing, his heart weak, and he knew he did not have much time left. "I have no children of my own," he told Harrison. "No family to speak of. This ranch has been my life, and I want it to continue after I am gone. I want you to have it, Harrison, you and Caroline. You have earned it 10 times over, and I know you will take care of it the way it deserves." Harrison was stunned. "Sir, I cannot accept such a gift. The ranch is worth a fortune." "It is not a gift," Mr. Davis said firmly. "It is payment for years of loyal service and a down payment on years to come. I have already had the papers drawn up. My lawyer has them. When I die, the ranch becomes yours, with the understanding that you will continue to run it well and take care of the workers who depend on it for their livelihoods." Harrison did not know what to say. He thought of Caroline, of their children, of the dream they had of owning their own land. This was so much more than they had ever imagined. "I do not know how to thank you," he finally managed. "Then do not. Just promise me you will be happy here, you and that lovely wife of yours and those beautiful children. Build a good life. That is all the thanks I need." Harrison promised, and 3 months later, Mr. Davis passed away peacefully in his sleep. True to his word, he had left the entire ranch to Harrison and Caroline, along with a substantial sum of money to ensure they could keep it running. The funeral was well attended, with people coming from all over the territory to pay their respects to a man who had been fair and generous in a time and place where those qualities were not always common. Harrison and Caroline stood together, their children holding their hands, and said goodbye to the man who had given them so much. Taking over the ranch was intimidating, but Harrison and Caroline approached it as they did everything, together. Caroline proved to have a good head for business, taking over the bookkeeping and financial management, while Harrison handled the day-to-day operations. They moved into the main ranch house, a sprawling structure that felt enormous after their small cabin. Caroline set about making it a home, just as she had with the cabin, filling it with warmth and light. They were fair employers, treating their ranch hands with respect and paying them honest wages. Word spread, and soon they had the best workers in the territory wanting to work for them. The ranch prospered under their management, the cattle healthy and the land well maintained. Over the next few years, their family continued to grow. Caroline gave birth to another son they named James in 1883 and twin daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, in 1885. The ranch house filled with the sounds of children laughing and playing, and Harrison often said he felt like the luckiest man alive. The children grew up with a strong sense of family and hard work. Thomas showed a natural aptitude for ranching, often following his father around and asking endless questions. Helen was quieter and more studious, loving books and learning. James was the adventurer, always getting into trouble and scrapes, but with such a good heart that it was hard to stay mad at him. Mary and Elizabeth were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and seeming to communicate in a language only they understood. Caroline still wrote letters, though now they were to friends she had made over the years, to business associates, to her children when they were old enough to write back. But she kept all of Harrison's original letters in a special box in her desk, tied with the same ribbon she had used all those years ago. Sometimes, when she was feeling nostalgic, she would take them out and read them again, remembering the woman she had been when she first came to Wickenburg. Lost, grieving, writing letters to a brother who would never answer. Harrison had kept his promise. He always answered her letters. But more than that, he had answered a longing she had not even known she had, for a home and a family and a love that was steady and true. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Harrison surprised Caroline with a trip back to the cottonwood tree where he had proposed. It was spring, and the desert was in bloom, wildflowers carpeting the ground in shades of yellow and purple and red. They sat under the tree, just the two of them, having left the children with Martha Chen for the afternoon. "You remember the first letter you wrote to me?" Harrison asked, his arm around Caroline's shoulders. "Of course. I was so nervous I almost did not give it to you." "I am glad you did. That letter changed my life." Caroline leaned her head on his shoulder. "You changed mine. I was drowning in grief and you threw me a lifeline." "We saved each other," Harrison said simply. "That is what love does." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun move across the sky. After a while, Caroline said, "I still miss Thomas sometimes. My brother, I mean. I wish he could have met you, could have known our children." "I wish that too, but I think he would be happy for you, seeing how your life turned out." "I think so too." Caroline lifted her head to look at Harrison. "I used to write to him because I had no one else who would understand. Now I have you and our children and a whole life full of people who care. But I still think about him, still talk to him in my head sometimes." "That is good," Harrison said. "The people we love never really leave us. They are part of who we are, woven into everything we do. Your brother is part of this family, even if he never got to meet us." Caroline felt tears on her cheeks, but they were gentle tears, the kind that came from healing rather than hurting. "How did I get so lucky?" she whispered. "I ask myself the same question every day," Harrison said, pulling her close and kissing the top of her head. "Every single day." As the years passed, the Blake Ranch became one of the most successful in Arizona territory. Harrison's reputation for fairness and Caroline's business acumen made them respected throughout the region. They weathered droughts and hard winters, economic downturns and the occasional rustler, but they did it together, their partnership as strong as ever. The children grew up strong and happy. Thomas took over more and more of the ranch operations as he got older, working alongside his father and learning everything Harrison could teach him. Helen discovered a love of teaching and started a small school on the ranch for the workers' children, much to her parents' pride. James turned out to have a gift with horses and became the ranch's head wrangler. Mary and Elizabeth were still deciding their paths, but showed promise in everything they tried. When Arizona became a state in 1912, Harrison and Caroline were in their 50s, their hair graying but their love as strong as ever. They stood on the porch of their ranch house, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, and watched the celebrations in town through a telescope one of their sons-in-law had brought. "We have built something good here," Caroline said, taking Harrison's hand. "We did," Harrison agreed. "A life worth living, a family worth cherishing. Do you ever regret staying? You were planning to go to Montana that summer." Harrison laughed. "Not for a single second. Montana did not have you." "Montana's loss," Caroline said with a smile. That evening, after the children and grandchildren had gone to their own homes, Caroline and Harrison sat together in the study that had been Mr. Davis's all those years ago. The room had become their favorite place, filled with books and comfortable chairs and memories of all the decisions they had made there over the decades. Caroline pulled out the box of letters, the ribbon faded now, but still holding them together. She untied it carefully and spread the letters out on the desk. "You remember what you wrote in this one?" she asked, picking up one at random. Harrison took it from her and read, his lips moving silently. Then he smiled. "I was telling you about the horse I was training, the stubborn one. You ended up buying him from Mr. Davis," Caroline remembered. "You kept him for years. He was a good horse, ornery but loyal." They went through more letters, reminiscing about the people they had been when they wrote them, young and uncertain, and finding their way to each other one written word at a time. "I am glad you saw me that night," Caroline said finally, "writing my letters to no one. "I am glad I had the courage to speak to you," Harrison replied, "though I almost did not. I thought you would think I was crazy, asking you to write to me instead." "I thought you were a little crazy," Caroline admitted with a laugh, "but in the best way. You gave me hope when I had forgotten what it felt like." Harrison reached out and took her hand, bringing it to his lips just as he had that night under the stars all those years ago. "You gave me a reason to stop running," he said. "You gave me a home." They sat together long into the night, reading old letters and remembering, grateful for every moment that had brought them to this place, to this life they had built together. Harrison lived to be 73 years old, still working the ranch until a few months before the end. He died peacefully in his sleep in 1925, with Caroline holding his hand just as she had held her brother's all those years ago. But this time was different. This time, she could look back on a life fully lived together, on decades of love and partnership and joy. Caroline lived another 7 years after Harrison's death, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She never remarried, saying that she had been blessed with one great love, and that was more than most people got. She spent her final years writing her memoirs, telling the story of how a grieving woman writing letters to no one had met a cowboy who promised to always answer, and how that promise had changed both their lives forever. On the day she died, her children found her at her desk with a letter in front of her. It was addressed to Harrison, telling him about her day, about the grandchildren, about how much she missed him but how grateful she was for the time they had together. Next to it was another letter, this one addressed to her brother Thomas, telling him all about the wonderful life she had lived and thanking him for giving her the courage to follow him west all those years ago. They buried Caroline next to Harrison under that same cottonwood tree where he had proposed, where they had spent their 10th anniversary, where they had always gone when they needed to remember how it all began. The tree had grown tall and strong over the years, its roots deep in the Arizona soil, just like the family that had started with 2 lonely people and a box of letters. The Blake Ranch continued to prosper for generations, run by their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, each one knowing the story of how it all began. The original letters, carefully preserved, were kept in the family archives, a reminder that sometimes the greatest adventures start with the smallest acts of courage. A sad woman writing to someone who could not answer, and a cowboy brave enough to say, "Write to me instead. I will always answer." And he had. Through 60 years of marriage, through good times and hard times, through 5 children and countless grandchildren, through drought and plenty, through every joy and sorrow life brought their way, Harrison had kept his promise. He had always answered with his words and his actions and his steady, unwavering love. In the end, that was what mattered. Not the ranch or the money or the success they had achieved. What mattered was that 2 lonely souls had found each other in the vast expanse of the Wild West and built a life together, one letter, one day, one moment at a time. They had taken their grief and loneliness and transformed it into something beautiful and lasting, a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone. The story of Harrison and Caroline Blake became a legend in Wickenburg, told and retold to new generations. The saloon where they first met eventually burned down, but a plaque was placed where it had stood, commemorating the spot where a lonely woman writing letters to no one had caught the eye of a cowboy passing through, and how that chance encounter had changed both their lives forever. On summer evenings, when the heat of the day had faded and the stars were bright in the desert sky, you could sometimes see the Blake descendants gathered under the cottonwood tree, reading from the old letters and telling the story again. The story of how love could bloom in the most unexpected places, how grief could be transformed into joy, and how a simple promise to always answer could become the foundation of a life well lived. And somewhere in the vastness of whatever comes after this life, two souls who had found each other in Wickenburg, Arizona territory in 1878 were together still, writing letters to each other across eternity, secure in the knowledge that no matter what, the answer would always come. Because that was what they had promised each other all those years ago, and they had never broken a promise yet. The end came not with sadness but with celebration, with gratitude for a love that had started with ink on paper and grown into something that would outlast them both. Their great-great-grandchildren still lived on the ranch, still worked the land, still told the story of the woman who wrote letters to no one and the cowboy who said write to me instead. And in a way they were still there too, in every sunset watched from the porch of the ranch house, in every letter written with care, in every promise kept, in every act of love both big and small. They were woven into the fabric of the family they had created, the land they had tended, the community they had served. The story of Harrison and Caroline Blake was not just a story of romance, though it was certainly that. It was a story about healing, about finding hope in darkness, about the courage it takes to open your heart again after loss. It was about the power of words to bridge the distance between two lonely souls, and the power of love to transform those souls into something greater than they had been alone. Every year on the anniversary of their first meeting, the family would gather at the cottonwood tree and read selected letters aloud, keeping the tradition alive. The children would listen wide-eyed to the story they had heard many times before, but never tired of hearing, about great-great-grandma Caroline, who was so sad. She wrote letters to her dead brother, and great-great-grandpa Harrison, who loved her so much he promised to always write back. The letters themselves, carefully preserved in acid-free boxes, numbered in the hundreds. Some were long and detailed, others just a few lines scrawled quickly before bed. Some were about important matters, decisions to be made or problems to be solved. Others were about nothing in particular, just the small details of daily life that became precious when shared with someone you loved. One letter in particular had become a family favorite. It was from Harrison to Caroline, written about 5 years into their marriage when Thomas was 4 and Helen was 2. In it, Harrison wrote, "Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and watch you sleeping next to me, our children safe in their beds, and I cannot believe this is my life. I cannot believe I get to have this, to have you, to have all of it. I think about that night in the saloon, how close I came to just walking away, to never speaking to you at all. What would have happened to us if I had not found my courage? Where would we be now? I thank God every day that I was brave enough to speak to you, that you were brave enough to trust me. Everything good in my life started with you, Caroline. Everything." That letter, more than any other, captured the essence of what they had meant to each other, the miracle they had found in each other. It was read at every anniversary gathering, and there was never a dry eye when it was finished. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the Blake Ranch remained in family hands, modernizing when necessary, but holding on to the values that Harrison and Caroline had established all those years ago. Fair treatment, honest work, respect for the land and the animals, and the people who depended on the ranch for their livelihood. In the main house, now over 130 years old but lovingly maintained, there was a room dedicated to Harrison and Caroline's memory. Their photographs hung on the walls, along with some of Harrison's whittled figures and samples of Caroline's needlework. But the centerpiece was always the letters, displayed in rotating exhibitions so that, every few months, different ones could be read and appreciated. Scholars came from universities to study the letters, seeing in them a window into frontier life and the development of Arizona Territory. Romance writers came to find inspiration in the love story they told. Historians came to understand the economics and challenges of running a large ranch in that era. But for the family, the letters were simply a connection to their roots, a reminder of where they came from and the love that had made it all possible. The ranch itself sprawled across thousands of acres, much of it preserved in its natural state as a tribute to Harrison's belief in good stewardship of the land. The cattle still grazed on the same hills where Harrison had ridden, and the cottonwood tree where he had proposed to Caroline was protected by a fence to ensure it would endure for generations to come. Every member of the Blake family knew the story by heart. They knew about Thomas Vaughn, Caroline's brother, whose death had sent her west and into a grief so profound she could only express it through letters to someone who could not answer. They knew about Harrison, the drifter with a troubled past who had been brave enough to offer himself as a correspondent to a sad woman in a saloon. They knew about Mr. Davis, who had given them their chance. They knew about Martha Chen and George the bartender and all the other people who had been part of the story. But most of all, they knew about love, about how it could surprise you when you least expected it, about how it could heal wounds you thought were permanent, about how it could grow from something as simple as words on paper into something that lasted for generations. The final letter in the collection was the one Caroline had been writing when she died, the letter to Harrison telling him about her day. It was unfinished, ending mid-sentence, but the family had decided to preserve it exactly as she had left it. In a way, it seemed fitting. Their conversation had ended, but their love had not. It lived on in their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, in the ranch they had built, in the community they had served, in the story that would be told for as long as people believed in the power of love to change lives. On warm Arizona evenings, if you stood very quietly near the cottonwood tree, some people swore you could almost hear them. Two voices, one male and one female, laughing together over some shared joke, talking about their day, making plans for tomorrow. Just two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life together, one letter at a time. And if you visited the Blake family cemetery, you would find two headstones side by side under that same tree. Harrison Blake, 1852 to 1925, the first one read, "Beloved husband, father, grandfather, he always kept his promises." Caroline Vaughn Blake, 1854 to 1932, read the second. "Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, she found her way home." Between the two headstones was a bronze plaque with an inscription chosen by their children. "Here lie two souls who met in loneliness and created a lifetime of love." He saw her writing letters to no one. He said, "Write to me, I will always answer." And he did, from that day until his last, and beyond. The story ended there, under the Arizona sun, in a place where the desert met the sky and love had conquered loneliness so many years before. But it was not really an ending at all. It was a continuation, a legacy, a promise kept across generations. As long as there were Blakes in Arizona, as long as the ranch endured, as long as the letters were preserved and the story was told, Harrison and Caroline's love would never truly end. It would live on, eternal as the desert stars, enduring as the land they had loved, powerful as the words they had written to each other in those early days when they were just two lonely people reaching out across the darkness, hoping to be heard, hoping to be answered, hoping to find in each other what they had both been searching for all along. A home, a partner, a love that would last forever. And they had found it. Against all odds, in the Wild West of 1878, in a dusty town in Arizona Territory, they had found it. They had found each other, and in doing so, they had found everything that mattered. The rest, as their descendants liked to say, was just details. Beautiful, important details that made up a life well lived, but details nonetheless. The heart of it, the soul of it, the truth of it was simple. Two people had loved each other completely, had built a life together from nothing but words and hope and determination, and that love had echoed down through the years, touching everyone who came after them, a gift that kept on giving long after the givers were gone. That was the story of Harrison Blake and Caroline Vaughn, the cowboy and the letter writer, the two lonely souls who found each other in Wickenburg and created something that would outlast them both. A love story for the ages, a testament to the power of connection, a reminder that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is reach out to another person and say, "I see you, I hear you, and if you will let me, I will walk beside you for as long as we both shall live." They had done that, and the world was richer for it, brighter for it, better for it. And that, in the end, was all that anyone could ask for, to leave the world better than they found it, to touch lives in positive ways, to love and be loved in return. Harrison and Caroline had done all of that and more, and their story would continue to inspire as long as there were people who believed in the transformative power of love.